When we think about democracy, we tend to picture something already built, something finished. But democracy, as our guest today says, is never finished. No country has gotten it perfect, not even here at home. And the places where democracy is still being tested may offer some of the clearest lessons about what it takes to sustain it. Today, I'm talking with Amy Hamelin, a former USAID Foreign Service Officer who spent her career in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. She'll talk about the lessons she carried with her from each of these places and what they reveal about the people and institutions that keep democracy alive. Her point, and one she comes back to again and again, is that democracy is a work in progress, one that depends on people showing up and on institutions worth showing up for. So, let's get into it and meet Amy.
Well, Amy, welcome to Global Development Interrupted.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'm very happy you're here too. I'm very excited for our conversation today. But before we get started, can you just tell me your full name and where you're currently sitting?
Absolutely. My name is Amy Hamelin, and I am currently sitting in Vienna, Virginia, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C.
But one of the things that I always start with is a fun fact. So can you give us a fun fact?
So I love this. This is such a great way to start a podcast. My one-liner is that I have been kissed by a president. That definitely requires, given our history as a country, some explanation.
Yeah, I mean, that could be a positive and a negative, Amy.
It could be a really crazy story. It kind of is, but not in a way that many people may expect. So one of my first jobs after Peace Corps was with the Carter Center, which is the organization that former President Jimmy Carter, may he rest in peace and in power, that he founded after his presidency to continue his important work. I joined them shortly after coming back from the Peace Corps and stayed for a couple of years, but knew I would eventually go to grad school. And so right before I left the Carter Center, I went down to Plains, Georgia, which is where President and Mrs. Carter are from. Not every Sunday, every once a month, say, he would teach Sunday school at his church. And so a colleague of mine decided to go down and sat through Sunday school. And miraculously, after the service, he came to see my colleagues and I and said, hey, why don't you join Rosalind and I for lunch? And then we'll give you a tour of the town, which it's a very, very small town. And during the tour, I was thinking to myself, wow, I need to find a way to tell him that I'm leaving. And so I finally said, hey, President Carter, I remember when a month ago or so at the last staff meeting, your assistant was leaving and you gave her a big kiss on the cheek. Hey, I'm just wanting to let you know that I am also leaving the Carter Center to go to grad school. And I'm wondering, can I get that kiss? And he kind of laughed and pulled me over and gave me a big kiss on the cheek.
Let's talk about your history. So where did you grow up?
My story, and I think it's important because it tells you a little bit about where I came from and how I got to sort of why I pursued the career that I pursued. I was born in a really small town in Pennsylvania. It was very homogenous, pretty rural farm town. And I was always intrigued by other cultures and the idea of other countries and languages, and knew that there was a huge world outside. And I knew that I wanted to somehow be a part of that at some point. Now, this really goes back to the advent of computers. I'm making myself sound really ancient, but our guidance counselor had a very primitive sort of prototype of an online career assessment tool. I know they're much more sophisticated now, but I answered all of the questions and pressed the button, and out popped the 5 most suitable careers for me. And at the top of that list was Foreign Service Officer. I had no idea what a Foreign Service Officer was, what they did, how to go about becoming one. My guidance counselor, frankly, didn't know a whole lot more than I did, but he wisely counseled, hey, why don't you go to school in Washington, D.C.? So I ended up at American University.
What I love about that story is that you're in this small town, Pennsylvania, and this computer tells you Foreign Service Officer, and everyone goes, what?
Yeah. Everybody's like, I have.
Are you sure?
No. Yes.
But it also makes me question, what were you putting in on that survey? You knew that there was more out there. How did you know there was more out there? What was that interest stemming from?
I guess it was a response to that homogenous society. People were very similar, came from similar backgrounds. And we did have, for example, up the street, one family from India. And I remember being just so completely intrigued by them and how different they were. And they were very friendly and became really good friends of ours. And I think it was just those little introductions to people that were very different that made me want to go to the source, made me want to travel to other places. So as I said, I went to American University, I studied international relations, and as a result, I decided that the next logical step for me would be to join the United States Peace Corps. I had studied French in high school, and so when Peace Corps saw that, they said, great, we're going to send you to Mali in West Africa. But what I found so interesting about Peace Corps is here I am living in a small village in a mud hut with no electricity and no running water. And all of a sudden I had this realization that this is what poverty looks like. But frankly, this is how the vast majority of the people around the globe live. Really beginning to understand their lived experience at a very grassroots level. But what I also realized is that the people in my village were incredibly disconnected from their government. It was a cotton growing area of Mali. There was a state-run cotton company that basically dictated everyone's lives, the cost of the inputs that they needed to grow the cotton, the price that people received. And these people were just so distant from the decision makers who had an enormous impact on their life. So put a pin in that for a second, because we'll come back to it in a moment. But after Peace Corps, I returned to the United States and ended up, as I mentioned, at the Carter Center and some of their election work, observing elections in other countries and kind of getting into democracy, so to speak. And at first I was really, really uncomfortable by that concept. It seemed icky to me that we were pushing our form of government and our way of thinking and acting and behaving on citizens of other countries. And I would say that shortly after, I had this really aha moment of, wait a second, what is democracy after all? And it was really all about giving people a voice in and about the things that impact them on a daily basis. I thought back to those farmers in my village in Mali, and I thought about how different their lives might have been if they had more influence over that state-run cotton company, if they had more of a say in the things that were happening to them, about them. And so that moment really crystallized for me the importance of helping people in other countries and in our own, frankly, to build, protect, preserve democracy. Because in the end, we all want to have a say in the things that impact our lives.
And I also feel that people who work in it should be questioning it. Like, you shouldn't be like totally gung-ho, like this is what we're going to do. So I think coming in with critical thinking is also very important to the whole process.
Right. I think the other important distinction is that people may be under the impression that USAID or the US government or partners like the Carter Center go into a country and tell them what to think and do, which systems to use, which policies to pursue. And that's not the case. Democracy is about, again, giving people freedom of choice and helping to inform their thinking. It's very process oriented, that it should be participatory and inclusive. There should be transparency and accountability. So really rather focusing on the process than the outcomes. I think that made me feel a lot more comfortable too.
So you started with an exam that told you to become a foreign servicer. You did Peace Corps. Then you went to the Carter Center where you dabbled in election. What eventually brought you, or what was your decision-making process to getting you at USAID as a foreign service officer?
I found myself at the National Democratic Institute, which was a long-standing partner of USAID overseas that focuses on democracy work. And while there, I did networking with other people that were there to get a sense of where the opportunities might be. And a couple of weeks later, one of these women ran up to me and said, "Hey, how would you like to manage our regional women's political participation program in Pakistan?" Yes, absolutely. Give me the contract. I'll sign on the dotted line. And probably a month later or less, I was in Islamabad, which was amazing and also overwhelming, intimidating. It's not a part of the world that I really knew. Mm-hmm. But I did have contacts at the embassy. I had a friend who introduced me to his colleagues, one of whom ended up being the man that I would marry, who himself was a foreign service officer with the State Department. And he encouraged me to join USAID as a foreign service officer, doing exactly what that career survey told me that I should do all those years ago.
All right. So love brought you to USAID and you fell in love with it. Can you give me the exact title that you had before USAID was dismantled?
My official title was Crisis Stabilization and Governance Officer, which is a mouthful and a title that, frankly, I never used. But a quick and dirty way to look at it is I was a democracy officer.
And then when you would talk about your work with family and friends, how did you explain what you did with them?
That is a great question and something I've pondered a lot lately. And to be honest, it's probably something I didn't do well enough to really explain to people how the work that we were doing overseas did have a positive impact on American security, prosperity, and our values. I was helping domestic civil society organizations to observe elections in their own country, to make sure that they followed the rules, and to report on violations of those rules if they found them. I was helping women to get more involved in politics. One of the things that I did before joining USAID was with the National Democratic Institute to encourage women's political participation. This first job was based in South Asia and to work with women from the prominent political parties in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. My job was to help train them on basic political skills. And I remember really distinctly one of the women from Pakistan coming up to me at the very beginning of the program and just looking me in the eye and saying very frankly, I don't know why my political party chose me for this assignment. I don't think I have the skills that you're looking for. I'm happy to be here, but I'm not a leader. And I remember thinking, okay, let's wait and see. She ended up being a star pupil. I could see it almost right away that she had incredible potential. And what I loved about this program and what I loved about what I was doing is I felt like my job was to literally hold up a mirror in front of a woman so that she could look into that mirror and see that potential, and then provide her with the tools that she needed to be effective. And this woman took this training to heart, and I immediately saw her kind of leap into action. So for example, after the 2005 earthquake in Pakistan that devastated the country, that killed over 70,000 people, she was one of the first people on the ground in Islamabad in front of an apartment building that had collapsed and killed 100 people. She was using her public speaking training to engage with the media, to help define the needs of the individuals on the ground who had lost their homes and family members. She was able to advocate for the collection of resources to make sure that these people were cared for. Fast forward many years, and I'm still in touch with her and many of the women in the program. She went on to become a political party leader, and importantly, she became a member of parliament in her country, representing women, their issues, their needs, her constituencies, and most importantly, showing young women in that country the potential that they have and what they can become.
What a great example of just the legacy of good.
Absolutely.
You supported this one woman and she just multiplied that in so many different situations. That's incredible.
She's an absolute rock star.
All right. So then you did transition out of Asia into Africa. Well, you headed to Kenya. Why were you going there?
Kenya is a relatively stable multi-party democracy that was in the midst of consolidation, facing significant security and political challenges. One of those challenges was violent extremism, which at the time was rapidly mutating. Recruitment and attacks were spreading to new areas of the country and also the broader region. And even in cases where we don't believe that a problem of violent extremism in a given country will have an impact on American soil, there's still the possibility that Americans are in the wrong place at the wrong time in a country where there is a terrorist attack. Preventing terrorism in other countries also protects American economic interests overseas. So this is what drove our determination of focus in a place like Kenya.
What did you end up doing in Kenya?
The reason the Kenya example I think is so compelling, and one of the reasons why I enjoyed the work so much, is because it was all about connecting those dots between defense, our military, diplomacy, our diplomats at the State Department, and development through people like myself at USAID. It is a challenge. Development people don't always understand the military, and sometimes they don't even want to go there. It's kind of a natural reaction. And the same, I think, is true on the military side. And so I got to the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi, started looking at my portfolio and figuring out how things were shaping up there on the ground. And what I realized pretty quickly is, we were very siloed. There were so many different agencies that were working on this problem set, but largely in isolation, or maybe at minimum, we were just sharing basic information. And I will say that I had a really great counterpart at the State Department who had the same observations, and we had struck up a good relationship. And he said, look, we really need to establish a working group to bring all of these people together, to kind of force the issue, to see how much further we can get if we work together across the 3Ds: defense, diplomacy, development. We started meeting and building some trust, because these things don't happen overnight. People don't divulge things unless they're in an environment that feels comfortable. So we started just basic exchange of information. We got to the point where we were doing joint site visits. As a civilian member of the government, I was not allowed to go to the border between Kenya and Somalia, just rife with conflict and very unstable and unsafe. But my military colleagues could go, and they had the resources to get there. So working together as a group, we decided that we should do a joint site visit up to that border. Got on a military plane, which was exciting in and of itself for me, not so much for them, and made that visit. And I will say that it also had a really profound impact on the Kenyans that we met there, because they were like, wait a second. Here you are with your development person. You've got the military guys in their camo. You've got the State Department guy in his suit and tie. You're all here together? Like, that's really interesting. My military colleagues took me up to a Kenyan border patrol station where all of their military are living in these tattered tents, deathly afraid of the challenges and the dangers that they faced for every good reason. And soldiers were skeptical of these communities, because in those communities, there must be people who were members of extremist organizations. And the community knows what's going on. They know when a stranger shows up in their midst, and they know when that person starts saying things that sound suspect. But if there is not trust between that community and the local military, they're not going to report that. They're afraid of what's going to happen to them if they show up. Maybe they'll be suspected as terrorists instead. So there was absolutely no trust. And so working through our partners, USAID partners, and through our military counterparts, we were able to start to build that trust, to the point where the communities knew that if they went to their counterparts, their information would be acted on, that the military would take steps to help keep those communities safe, that together they could actually reach these goals. And again, it really comes down to the fact that you can't approach a problem like this successfully if it's not done holistically. My favorite way of describing that is the parable of the three blind men. I think there were three, who were led up to an elephant, and each of them was asked to describe what they were touching. What animal was this? One man was touching the trunk and described something. Another man was touching the tail, and another man was touching the midsection. And of course, they came up with radically different ideas of what this animal was. Let's pretend that animal is violent extremism. If you've got people experiencing it in different ways, civil society is touching the tail, the military is touching the trunk, maybe the government is touching the midsection. The only way to fully see that animal and to be able to respond in kind is if everybody's in the same room. And so I think that was really one of the major successes that we had in the country.
You know what else it sounds like?
What's that?
Democracy.
Wow. Love it. It's absolutely right.
I mean, every voice is represented, right? That sounds like a democratic solution there.
That is the through line of my career, is helping people use their voice and advocating for that space and giving them the tools that they need to be able to do it.
Did you see impact from that work that was being done?
I do think that trust led to increased communications. With increased communications, I think that everyone was able to do their job in terms of mitigating, preventing the attacks before they happened, and preventing people from joining. It's a long-term process. And again, it connects back to those broader development issues. And it does give me pause because, again, with the end of, by and large, U.S. development assistance, I do have concern that in communities that we are no longer serving, that the enabling environment for terrorism will become more of an issue, that more people may be lured by the financial and other appeal of extremist organizations, that we may see a real rollback of the progress that we've made.
One of those places, though, that maybe is the worst case scenario in terms of when democracy falls apart is South Sudan. And you were placed there. And what were you facing when you entered the country then?
Very different scenario, right? And this goes back to really tailoring our support to a particular context. So South Sudan was and still is, sadly, a very unpredictable place that experienced several decades of conflict with Sudan over its own independence. And even after South Sudan's independence, they had another 6 years of civil war. And so as I got there, they were several years post-civil war in the midst of trying to implement a peace agreement, but it was going very slowly. There was opposition to its implementation. There continued to be local conflict between people of different ethnicities. There was certainly conflict within the government between the different factions. Keep in mind, again, that South Sudan is a country that, because of all of this conflict, is home to numerous internally displaced persons camps, high levels of poverty, very poor health outcomes, education outcomes, a population that's been absolutely traumatized by the conflict and the kinds of things that they've seen and lived through and endured. That really shaped the way that we approached our democracy assistance in the country. We realized that in a new democracy or a country that was trying to, with international assistance, move towards democratic governance, that one of the things that you really need to focus on is educating the general public on what it means to be a citizen in a democracy. So we did a lot of work with civil society organizations around the country, helping them to do what we would call civic education. We also funded independent radio stations around the country and trained journalists, including in investigative journalism, so that they could provide information to citizens so that they could engage effectively, so that they had the information that they needed to make decisions. We did a lot of voter education in anticipation of elections so that people could make informed decisions about candidates, knew about the mechanics of voting, where they had to go to register, what marking a ballot was even going to look like. The other component of it that was really critical was a focus on conflict. It was about trying to promote social cohesion, bringing back a very fractured, polarized society, bringing people back together as neighbors, as members of the same community, to try again to tamp down on violence and to move people forward into a more unified society, and also to really address that trauma that people had endured.
I think in some background on, because when we talk about violence, we talk about trauma, I think for many Americans, our sense of security, we have a very strong sense of security. We feel safe in the spaces that we occupy. And I remember speaking with a man from Kenya that I worked with, and he was talking about the work that he did in South Sudan. And he would have to flee. Like, he couldn't stay overnight in South Sudan because he had so many threats against his life for working on a project that was funded through the United States government. And it was a health project. So it was like, again, it was just serving the community around health needs. And he was being attacked for it.
I think another thing to emphasize is that when Foreign Service officers, USAID or state, or our military colleagues, for example, are serving in a place like South Sudan, you're serving on your own. My family at the time, my husband and my son, were in Kenya. Now, I had all of the security that the U.S. government can provide me. I couldn't just go anywhere I wanted to, whenever I wanted to. Every single movement had to be coordinated with our security people, including visiting our projects up country. So we would once a month have a joint site visit, State Department, various offices within USAID, military colleagues to go and visit these projects because it had to be done in an extremely secure way. But that brings me around to our local staff and other implementing partners who are the real heroes of the day. I think very fondly of the people that I worked with there, and they are heroes and patriots. These are people who made sacrifices, not just a year of their life like I did and most of my American colleagues did, but years. What I mean by that is because of the circumstances that you described, most of these people had their families living in Kenya or Uganda. They got to see them maybe 3-4 times a year if they were lucky. Sometimes they were targets because they worked for the US government. But these are people that believe deeply in the future of their country. There are people that were completely dedicated to a better future, if not for themselves in their lifetime, in their children's lifetime. These are people that sacrificed an unbelievable amount, in part because they didn't really have the luxury to just sit back and do whatever it was that, was deeply interesting for them. They knew that if things were to change in South Sudan, it was because they were willing to stay and stand, go into that office every day and do whatever it was that they could to help citizens in their country to create that change that they were looking for.
And USAID provided that platform for them to do it.
Absolutely.
The other thing I'm thinking about is you talk a lot about funding, different local partners around civics education, funding journalists into investigative reporting. All of these things are very dangerous because they push back on the violent extremists and the actors of violence in that country. Is there a story that you remember from that experience that sort of represents both, I think, the situation itself, but also the hope within the country?
Just as I've spoken of our local staff in countries like that, I was incredibly inspired by members of civil society in places like South Sudan who continued to work against all odds. They had even less protection. Our local staff, to some degree, had the protection of the U.S. Embassy, but these civil society partners were at great risk. Many of them had been imprisoned, had been rounded up, had been locked up by their government, only to be released after experiencing terrible conditions. And what do? They went right back to the work that they were doing before. Sometimes they had to leave the country for a while and would continue their efforts from outside, but they never lost sight of that vision and that dream that they had for the future. I can't imagine having to make those kinds of choices and having to make those kinds of sacrifices and having to live with that level of risk and insecurity. But these are the people that inspired me then and continue to inspire me even now.
One of the things that I appreciate you saying very early on was that some of the younger democracies that we see in the world now have lessons for us older democracies and how we handle conflict and security and attacks on our elections, democracy in general.
Right.
And so is that where you're seeing hope?
It is actually. One of the things that I've done since losing my job with USAID is to volunteer with some of our Southern African organizations. These are organizations that have really been left in a lurch. They're struggling to keep the lights on, but they're doing an amazing job. And so I got off the phone earlier today with one of my partners in South Africa, and I was telling him about this podcast, and he would agree 100% with what you just said, Leah, about the lessons from countries like South Africa and how they can be applied in countries, frankly, even the United States. And so the example that he and I discussed this morning from South Africa was the end of the apartheid regime and the onset of multi-party democracy, which in all honesty was something that USAID helped to support. Now, we were not the driving factor in all of that, but we did provide some funding to help with that process. And the reason he emphasized why apartheid came to an end was, yes, there was international pressure. That was obviously very important. But what it really came down to was more democratic-minded political parties, the African National Congress among them. It was civil society. It was private citizens. It was the private sector. It was people coming together again in this whole of society approach to say this is not right. This must end. But even after South Africa had transitioned to a multi-party democracy post-1994, they really invested in creating strong democratic institutions. Again, USAID and other partners were with them all the way in this process, but locally driven, absolutely. But there was a moment in time where they faced real challenges. So democracy doesn't produce overnight results. It's very easy for citizens to feel a sense of disenchantment. I thought that the roads would be paved in gold. I thought that this was going to be the land of milk and honey, and it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen quickly. And there was a South African leader by the name of Jacob Zuma who came into power, had more authoritarian tendencies, really took advantage of this disenchantment to begin assembling or trying to really push back against these democratic reforms and trends. And what I think is so miraculous about South Africa is despite the battering, these these institutions, these democratic institutions, weathered the test of time. They bent. They did not break. And again, my South African colleague really emphasized to me that the lesson here is, once again, it was civil society, it was journalists, independent media, the private sector who came together to say, no, we are not going backwards. So it's an important message, and one that I think that we need to heed and consider.
Which seems to be a central theme, which is bringing all these different voices together.
But I think the other lesson is that democracy is not a linear process. There are moments of backsliding. Even in the most advanced democracies, progress is not assured. We cannot be asleep at the wheel, no matter which country you're living in, no matter how long your democracy has been established. It is a work in progress, and it takes every one of us to be engaged and involved citizens if we want to preserve that system of government.
Wow. Amy, I am just so glad that a computer told you to be a Foreign Service officer. And thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story.
Thank you, Leah. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and leave a review. It helps more people find us at a moment when these conversations really matter. And if you'd like to stay connected, subscribe to Global Development Interrupted on Substack. You'll get new podcast episodes, GDI insights, reflections from practitioners who've lived this work, and Conversations on Planes, our monthly Q&A series. It's all free, and it's all rooted in the same mission, keeping global development visible. See you next time.